was that they would not be called before the McCarthy Committee. Because if you got called before the McCarthy Committee, your reputation was made for life. But if they didn't call you, then you had missed the boat. Nobody ever heard of you. So it was a big thing. And the people that really hated McCarthy were the people he'd never called. So that's the little paradox that you run into. But after the Panic of 1837, the Rothschilds in London decided the United States was growing so rapidly and getting so rich. And one of the reasons was we had great health care in this country. We had homeopathy and naturopathy. And the people were just so darn healthy they could work 18 hours a day and nothing was ever wrong with them. This went on until 1913 when John D. Rockefeller decided to take over the medical profession and switch us from homeopathy to German allopathic medicine, which used a lot of drugs and radical surgery and also was very profitable. So since then, Americans have been getting sicker and sicker and sicker because we got away from that natural life that is so good for American people. And now we're taking all these expensive drugs, and they now even publish the side effects. They advertise on television. This drug will damage your liver, it'll damage your kidneys, it'll damage your heart, and people take them anyway. Because the medical profession tells you the benefits will outweigh the risks. I mean, you may have a medical problem, but a damaged liver and a damaged kidneys, that's not going to bother you. Don't worry about it. So that's the logic behind the medical profession today. And the reason I mention that is because the man behind the Federal Reserve System was John D. Rockefeller, same man who was behind the takeover of the medical profession. What I found out after many years was no matter what monopoly I went into, I was dealing with the same small cast of characters. So my work got easier and easier. I just rewrote the same thing about everybody I was writing about. Whether they were in the oil monopoly, the medical profession, legal monopoly, politics, it was all the same crowd of people. Because this was a closed shop. They always kept everybody out except their old, small, elite crowd. And that's the way they operated. So when they decided to split this country up into two small countries, two Balkan countries, President Lincoln wanted to fight. So he called the bankers in from New York and he said, well, we're going to have a war. Now I need some money. They said, sure, we'll give you money. How much you need? And he told them. And they said, the interest rate will be 19%. Well, the interest rate at that time was 1%. So what they were telling Lincoln was, we're not going to let you have any money, because nobody could pay 19%. And so Lincoln asked around, and he found out you could go to the Treasury Department, and they would print the money. It was right there in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8. Congress shall control money. And the Treasury was part of the government. So he had greenbacks printed up, and he financed the Civil War. But this was non-interest bearing currency. See, all the money we have is promissory notes, and it carries interest because it's issued against interest-bearing bonds. So your dollar bill in your pocket is carrying 10% interest, which is very profitable for the bankers. And so the bankers lost all the interest on that money in the Civil War, so they assassinated President Lincoln. So 100 years later, we have a bright young president from Harvard, and of course they never taught him any history at Harvard. And this President Kennedy, he asked some of his associates, he says, now what can I do to really get through to the American people and get them behind you? So one of his advisors said, why don't you get the Federal Reserve System off the backs of the American people? They'll put a statue up to you in every town in the country. So Kennedy said, well, that sounds pretty good. As I say, you never heard about Lincoln's problem. And so he went to the Treasury Department and had them print up greenback notes. They're collector's items today. And so immediately the bankers had Lyndon Johnson, his vice presidential candidate, he had already decided to dump him. And Johnson said, Mr. President, we have a little problem down in Dallas, and we need you to come down there, and that'll get the party back on the track. When Kennedy went to Dallas, they had 5 different assassination teams waiting for him because they couldn't afford to miss out on this one. And the one that did him in was a group from Marseille, professional Sicilian hitmen. They were the ones that did the job. And of course, Oswald was drinking Coca-Cola and had no idea what was going on. But he was the guy that they blamed for it. And so this was your bankers again, running the show the way that they want to. And of course, I was a child of the Great Depression. And I remember those dark days in the early 30s when my father was out of work, had 6 children to feed, had no idea how to feed them. And this brings us to a very important point. Now, you've heard a lot here about longevity and vitamins and health. But let me tell you, the Federal Reserve System is the greatest threat to your health and security that you will ever have in your life. Because there were many, many, many nervous breakdowns and suicides and deaths caused during the Depression by people who simply could not carry on. They were just crushed by this terrible thing that had happened to them. They were good workers, and suddenly they had no jobs, they had no way of feeding their families, and this is the most crushing thing that can happen to you. So I never thought at that time that I would spend the rest of my life finding out who these criminals were who put over the Great Depression. But Congressman Charles Lindbergh warned the Congress and the American people during the great debate on the Federal Reserve System in 1913. He said, "This is the money trust, and if you enact this bill, your children will be enslaved and they will curse you." Well, he was exactly right, because in the Depression, the children had no food, and their parents were out of work. And but it was a great thing for the money crowd. They, of course, had sold all their stocks in 1929, just before the crash. Now, they took the cash and bought everything up for a penny on the dollar, just like they did in 1837, in the first panic we had in this country. It was the Rothschild representatives in the United States who went in and bought up the railroad stocks and the factory stocks for pennies, because they had the only cash in town. And they just take over everything. Now, when Alan Greenspan, our present chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, started his rate increases last year, and he put through 6 rate increases, and he was out to bankrupt the American people. Now, the most respected financial television commentator is Louis Rickazer, Wall Street Week. So after Greenspan had been up to his deviltry for about 5 months, and my own stock portfolio was dropping at the rate of $10,000 a week, and every stock that I had was perfectly good, but with these rate increases, it was making money tight, and the stocks were going down. It had nothing to do with the value of the stocks whatsoever. It was a typical financial maneuver to rob the American people. And so I was one of the people being robbed, and I was pretty sore about it. So I saw in Time magazine a joke about Alan Greenspan on March the 13th. And it said, how many Federal Reserve chairmen does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer is 1. So Greenspan holds the bulb, and the rest of the world revolves around him. And this is simply the situation that we have. We have a situation where the bankers are so powerful, one man has all the power. In every presidential election, at a point has come up that the Federal Reserve Chairman is more powerful than any presidential candidate. And he will decide who is going to be the next president. So they've decided that George Bush will be the next president. So therefore, Alan Greenspan is calling the turn, and that's why we had the 6 rate increases. He had 5 more interest rate increases up his sleeve in case he needed more. I don't think he's going to need any more because they've achieved their objectives, but that is to have a change of administration. And they want you to believe that a great change is coming and that there won't be any more interns in the Oval Office and so forth. But in fact, it's the same old crowd. Bush's father was head of the CIA before he became president and ambassador to China, where the biggest opium fields in the world are, the Golden Triangle, the world drug trade. So we're exchanging a sexual psychopath for a dope dealer is really what it amounts to. So let's hope it will be an improvement. Let's be optimistic. But I'm not promising you anything. Now, during Greenspan's rate increases, he was talking about hypothetical inflation. Hypothetical inflation is something that exists only in his own mind. No one else knows what it is. No one's ever seen it. But he was complaining about low unemployment and prosperity. We were having the greatest prosperity we've ever had. And Greenspan said, this is the wealth factor, and we have got to close in on it. In other words, he didn't want to see any of you making any money. So Louis Rukeyser said, on Wall Street Week, he was asked by one of his Wall Street broker friends there. They said, Louis, what do you think's going on here? And Louis said, well, it's commonly known that rich people get nervous when they see ordinary people getting too much money. And so they take it away from them. And that's exactly what was going on. Greenspan was trying to close down the money that was going to the people of the United States who were working hard. They were getting vacation homes. They were getting second cars. And that's when they pulled the rug out from under you. Because they're making money off of it anyway, but it's that jealousy. They don't want to see you have any independence or any authority. They want you to stay peasants, and they will make their move to try to bring that about. So this is the big gap between what they call the rich and the poor. In fact, it's no fun being rich when everybody else starts getting money. So the only way to enjoy your money is to make sure nobody else has any. And this is exactly what the Federal Reserve System does. They rob everybody, and so then the rich feel very secure. They say, well, we have our limousines and our chauffeurs, and everybody else is riding bicycles, like in China. And that's what they want. They want a Chinese country. They want a country of peons who will be absolutely subservient to the will of the big rich. And the Federal Reserve System itself was simply a plan whereby the richest people in the world would get even richer. When they had a secret meeting on Jekyll Island to plan the central bank plan and put it over on Congress, the membership of the Jekyll Island Club represented 1/6 of the wealth of the entire world. These weren't poor people who were trying to make a fortune on their own. They had their fortune. All they were interested in was seeing that nobody else ever made a fortune. So all of the prosperity that we have had has been made in spite of the government, in spite of the Federal Reserve System. Because they've been in there all the way fighting you. They don't want you to make any money. They take it away from you in taxes. They take it away from you in income tax. And the income tax itself was the vital part of the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. It was an amendment, a separate amendment to the Constitution, but its only purpose was to make sure that the American people would never have the independence which their own earning power would guarantee them. And to do that, the income tax amendment was prepared by the leading Wall Street lawyers of the people who put over the Federal Reserve System, Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan. They had their lawyers prepare the income tax amendment. Philander Knox was a lawyer from Oregon. He was Secretary of State and put it to Congress. And it was also drafted by Elihu Root, who was the lawyer for many of the wealthy people in New York. J.P. Morgan said, when I called in a lawyer and asked him if I can do something, he will tell me that I cannot do it. But he said, when I call in Elihu Root, he will tell me exactly how I can do what I want to do.